Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to wrap up some of the key ideas and thoughts from our study of the novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. These are some of the key concepts and ideas that you should review before our unit test. Now, there's two main important ideas or themes that you should take away from the novel. The first is this idea of realism, and the second are the causes and effects of loneliness and isolation. And these are the major themes that John Steinbeck was using in the book. Now, realism refers to the literary style and also to what happens to the characters. So we find that the characters have to accept their life as it is. And Steinbeck is painting this very uncompromising view of the people and of the place. There's nothing in there that makes it seem any better. There's no magic last-minute solution. There's no particularly happy ending. So all of this action, character development, and even the dialogue with the way that the field hands talk to each other represents, again, this realistic versus romantic vision of the world and that particular time period of the novel. Now, when it comes to loneliness and isolation, Steinbeck divides up the characters. And we find that our society, and particularly in this idea of the Great Depression and the lost generation here, has created outcasts of people who don't fit in. Economically, we have people who don't fit in because they don't have the money to get out of this situation. This includes the migrant workers who are unable to build up any kind of a job or any kind of stability from there. And then we have people who don't fit in socially, and that includes things like Curly's wife, who's the only female on the farm, Crooks, who is left out because of the color and because of the racism of the day, and Lenny, who, because of his developmental disabilities, doesn't really belong in any of these particular places. And then we have people who are left out because of the physicalities. Again, you could count Curly's wife in this group. You have Candy, who's grown old now and no longer has the physical strength to continue to work and add some sort of value in the society. And you have Crooks, who is also a cripple with his disabled back, in addition to the physical characteristic of being an African American in the 1930s. Now, Steinbeck does more than just present these people to us. He actually helps us to feel sympathetic for them. Even though these characters are alone and isolated, and in some cases not even all that likable, we find out some very interesting things. Steinbeck shows us that Curly's wife had her own dream, that she married Curly as a way to escape from another life that was really bad and was hoping for something better. This vision of being a Hollywood star and of getting away from her mother. I mean, how many of you haven't thought at some time about getting to leave all of the parental restrictions and getting out there on your own someplace? And Curly's wife thought that Curly was going to be her ticket out of this, and what she found is she was actually ended up in a much worse situation. We find Crooks, who tries to fight back against his loneliness through finding books. He tries to escape into the world of books and novels to find some way to find a world outside of his world where there's thoughts and people and company of some kind. But as he says, books are no good. A guy needs somebody. People need to have those kinds of connections with each other. We see Candy trying to find this connection. He offers to help and join up with George and Lenny, even offering him his entire life savings, which is about $250 at this time. And he says, look, I'll give it all to you if you just let me have a place to stay, a place to grow old, and a place to actually just go ahead and die. And then we meet Lenny, and Lenny sees the beauty in everything. As Slim says, even, he could tell a mean guy a mile off, and Lenny never did anything out of meanness. Anything that we've seen Lenny do in the book, from the smallest thing with the mice all the way to the death of Curly's wife, Lenny never did it because he wanted to hurt something. Even when Curly is punching him in the face, Lenny doesn't even defend himself until George starts yelling at him. And even then, that defense is a simple grabbing and holding on. So Lenny sees the beauty in everything. He comes into Crooks's room and doesn't even notice that Crooks is black. This isn't anything that's occurred to him. And he just sees Curly's wife as being pretty, where everyone else sees her as really trashy. So we have these very sympathetic characters in their loneliness and in their isolation. Now, there's some interesting things that you should pay attention to in the structure of the novel. And we talked about some of these in class, how Chapter 6 mirrors Chapter 1. It's the exact same setting. The structure seems to mirror the theme here. The men can't make any progress. They always end up right back where they began in the beginning. And we have this image in Chapter 6 of the snake that comes in. So you have this idyllic paradise kind of setting, like a Garden of Eden almost, but in the end, there's a snake in it. There's evil that does enter in. And we see almost the exact same dialogue. George repeats his idea about how his life could be so easy if he didn't have to look after Lenny. But in this particular version, his voice is completely flat. He has no emotion in it. He's thinking, this is not a dream of his anymore. This is now his life sentence. This is what he's going to have to deal with now. And George repeats the dream again, the whole story of the farm and the rabbits one more time for Lenny. And he tells Lenny to look over there, look over there across the river. See, way over there? That's like an image, an archetype of crossing a river is actually used for an image of death. You see a lot of the old gospel spirituals talking about crossing the river Jordan as a way to get to the other side, in other words, over to heaven. So Lenny is told to look across the river just before George goes ahead and pulls the trigger. And this is this reality of this moment, that the only place Lenny is going to see his dream is in death, that he's hoping that there will be a better place across the river, because it's not going to happen in life. Now, even though most of us don't like the ending and it's kind of a sad ending, we find that it's an honest ending. Steinbeck has set us up for this from the very beginning. All of these little bits of foreshadowing have actually come together and are actually happening. So we see Lenny has gotten in trouble again. If you get in trouble like you done before, come back to the brush, and that's exactly what he did. If he does a bad thing again like he did in Weed, and he does, only worse this time. George having to consider the same quality of life issues that Candy had to think about with his dog, where Candy was trying to consider, should I go ahead and put this dog out of his misery now, even though it's a sacrifice for me? George has to consider that same idea. What is Lenny's life actually going to be like if he's caught by Curly in this gang? So like Candy, George has to make this difficult personal choice that becomes a sacrifice, but it's for the betterment of the creature that's loved. We see that Candy's wife has turned out to be trouble, which is what everyone has been saying right from the beginning. And of course, the novel's title, this allusion to the Robert Burns poem that the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, or gang afterglay, if you want to go back to the Scottish version. And we do see that all of these plans that these men have made, they didn't actually come out the way that they had hoped that they would. Even though it's a short book, Steinbeck actually works in a fair amount of symbolism into the story. The farm itself, not the ranch where they're working, but this dream farm that they have, is George and Lenny's version of the American dream. And again, it's not really about having a particular type of land or having cows or chickens. It's about self-determination, the idea that they will be their own boss, that they can get up in the morning and decide for themselves how much work they're going to do, and the more work they do, the more food and things they'll get, and that they will be creating their own family on this ranch. We see Candy's dog as a type of symbolism, that whole little incident. I mean, why does Steinbeck even put that in there about this old dog? But it's foreshadowing the choice that George is going to have to make. And it highlights some of this realism again, the idea that the world is kind of cruel and indifferent. And this is what happens to things that are old and no longer useful. And this is what Candy is worried is going to happen to himself. And it also shows us Candy realizing his mistake, that he let a stranger shoot his dog, and realizing that he was the one that had the relationship with the dog. He had responsibility for the dog. He shouldn't have let Carlson take it out and just shoot it because Carlson was mad about the smell. It should have been an act of love that Candy did for the dog. And that George is going to have to learn this lesson and will have to make this choice for Lenny out of, again, this sense of love and responsibility and wanting to protect Lenny from pain. So all of these events are actually nicely foreshadowed, and you can see the symbolism that Steinbeck has put in throughout this very short book. Now, the names in the story are actually very deliberate. I know we've talked about Curly's wife and be like, what's Curly's wife's name? Couldn't Steinbeck, I mean, isn't he a good enough writer to think of a name for this character? But each one of the names actually fits the character really well if you break them down a little bit. George Milton, the name George actually stands for earth worker, which is exactly what George says. And then Milton brings us back to a famous poet who wrote something called Paradise Lost. Get it? So George is actually named after this author who wrote a novel about losing this vision of paradise, which is exactly what happens to the characters in the novel. Lenny's full name is Leonard Small. Leonard is the same word for lion, and you can see that again, that physical big strength that Lenny's got. But Small has to do with his mental ability, with his capacity. And so you get this contrast between the lion of his physicality and then the smallness of his brain and his cognitive abilities. The boss is never given a name. He's just this generic guy. He sort of represents all authority, all people who come in and tell you what you're supposed to do. There's no name, there's no personality. He could be interchangeable with any boss, any place and time here. Curly gets his name like a spring because he's wound up so tightly. He's described as having curly hair, but he's also got this temper in this boxer, and we know that he's about to spring out at somebody at some point. Curly's wife, we always mentioned having no particular name because everyone on the ranch just sees her as she's just that thing that belongs to Curly. And then Candy, because he's so sweet-tempered, he's this older man, but the sweetness of his temperament. And Soledad is the place of the town that they're talking about where the story is set, is the Spanish word for loneliness. So this theme is telegraphed right in the names that Steinbeck chooses for his characters and his setting. So why does this ending have to be so sad? I mean, why write this book if it's going to be this horrific bit? Well, there's a couple of things that are going on here at the end. When George shoots Lenny, he's also symbolically putting to death his own dream and his own future. And George and the reader, us reading the book, have to accept this reality that, as Slim says, never you mind, a guy gots to sometimes. That there's just times when you have to do difficult things in life, even if you don't want to do them, when you're not going to be rescued, when you just have to deal with whatever's put on your plate. The other men in this section don't get it. They don't see what George has done. They don't even realize that George has killed Lenny. They think that they sort of believe the story that George got the gun away from Lenny and was defending himself. But Slim, who's the prince of the ranch, the one that we're always told is wise, that has all the respect, he gets it. He sees what happened, he understands, and he maybe not applauds George, but commends George and says, this is what you had to do. You had to be strong enough to do this, and you did it. Don't worry about it. Don't have a guilty conscience. It had to happen. And George kind of loses the dream here. I mean, if you think about it practically, he still has Candy's money. Why can't he still go and get this farm? But the biggest part of the dream was always to have each other. And when George loses Lenny, the biggest and the best part of the dream is gone. And Steinbeck is telling you a realistic story. There's no last-minute saves. There's no particularly happy ending. That just sometimes in life, you've got to deal with what you're given. But it's not an overall sad and hopeless book. There is some hope in the story. The story is showing us that this is what people need, that they have this need to reach out to each other, to make these connections, to not be lonely and isolated. We saw that George took responsibility for Lenny. He didn't have to do that. We know that they didn't even have a family relationship, that Lenny just started following George around, and at first George treated him badly, but then George took on the responsibility and grew this relationship. We see Candy become included. He gets invited into this thing. We see this great moment in chapter 4 where Crooks and Lenny and Candy and Curly's wife were all able to form this bond in their loneliness. Even though each one has something distinct about them that makes them isolated, they were able to overcome that and come together. And what Steinbeck is trying to teach us is this is how we get through it. Sometimes life hands you miserable things, but the way to reach your American dream is to help each other and to find the ways to reach out and make those connections. And that's a wrap for Mice and Men. Hopefully you've been able to fill out your skeleton notes as you watched. And when you get back into class, we're going to be going over some of these concepts again, doing some practice things and reviews, and then finally having your unit test. So good night.